When I get to visit a place like this, I look for patterns, the gathering of shapes or repetitions of lines or clusters of colour. But then I always look for the interruptions, the light breaking through the clouds, the one mauve leaf amongst all the brown ones on the ground, or a shimmer in the canopy, or perhaps it's a bird that darts across my view and breaks the stillness. Patterns and interruptions. When I look at artwork, I often look for the interruptions too. And by that I mean the surprising bit, the unexpected bit that stops your eye, the line that juts out when it shouldn't have, or the colour that stands out to you above the other ones. Or perhaps it's the brushstroke that should have kept going but then was broken. Or where everything was smooth and then there's a roughly textured part, or where there's lots and lots of detail and then suddenly there's space. Maybe it's a sculpture or an image that places a figure in an unlikely scenario, or just a whole artwork that confronts an assumption about people or the world by presenting the opposite. We are experiencing a different kind of interruption. COVID has been an undoubtedly unwelcome and devastating interruption. For those worst affected, it's been relentless, tragic, and just plain unfair. For those privileged with job security, homes to isolate in, and access to healthcare, it's been an agonising pause. I don't know how many memes I've seen about it. There being 42 weeks in April and still being 7 years till Christmas. But one of the surprising and welcome outcomes of this great global pause has been the positive impact on the environment. Reduced travel, slowing production, has seen the earth breathe deeply and the flora and fauna respond in the most astounding ways. During this period, our family Sabbaths have looked a little different, and yours might have too. Rather than rushing off to church, I've laid in bed just a little bit longer. And over these past few months, I've actually come to appreciate the Sabbath pause even more. And also spend more time thinking about what it really is and what it really can be. Sabbath. God's invitation to pause and rest in a world that compels us to be busier and work harder and consume more. But of course, everything about our God is opposite, reverse, and revolutionary. In John 18:36, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." In Matthew 20:16, he says, "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last." And in Luke 22, he says, "The greatest among you shall serve." Everything about our God is opposite, reverse, revolutionary. Sabbath is revolutionary too. It's a holy interruption. Now, I've heard it said before that Sabbath is like a glimpse of heaven, and it is. We rest from work, we spend time with family and friends, we sing, we eat, we walk in nature. What are your favourite things about Sabbath? And what are your favourite Sabbath memories, and how do you savour your Sabbath hours? All of these things we do, time with friends and family, visiting church, they interrupt the monotony and the grind, and I'm sure all of those things are on the agenda for heaven. But as usual, God has even more he wants to give to us right now, more that he wants to teach us right now. And the Sabbath is about more than just rest for me. If we are going to be Sabbath keepers and have it in our name, we need to understand all that Sabbath stands for, the whole system that God designed. Sabbath is part of a whole plan for equality, justice, and peace, for all of humanity and for the planet. And perhaps a Sabbath practice that does not centre these things is not a Sabbath at all. In Scripture, we see that while God rested on the seventh day at creation, right in the beginning, and it was deemed to be holy or set apart in Genesis, there's no command about how people should interact with it or keep it until much later. In fact, we've got no indication throughout all the generations in Genesis that any of those characters, Noah, Abraham, kept anything like a Sabbath that was later kept by the Israelites after the Ten Commandments. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but there's certainly nothing written down about Sabbath behaviours or rituals. The first mention is after the Israelites have been released from slavery in Egypt and are in the wilderness. I love that word wilderness, by the way. And they're provided with manna, a food that seems to fall from heaven. And God instructs the people that they are to collect manna every day, just enough for one day, except for on the sixth day when they can collect extra for the seventh day. And then Moses says, like he's introducing it to them, "For tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord." It's interesting to note that this introduction to Sabbath practice is tied to the idea that there is enough for everyone, and we need not be threatened by or compete with anyone else. Then in Exodus 20, we get the 10 Commandments and the fourth commandment about the Sabbath. Now, I've often seen biblical teachers and preachers point out that the first 4 commands relate to our worship of God, and that Numbers 5 to 10 then point how we should relate to each other. So love for God and then love for humanity. However, I want you to notice this. The fourth command contains direction not only for Sabbath keeping as an act of worship and acknowledging that God is the creator, but it particularly names every level of society and says that Sabbath puts them on a level playing field. It says, "You shall not do any work, neither you, your son, your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, your livestock or the sojourner in your gates." It's like it's a pivot point in the 10 Commandments that links worship of God to how we treat and include others, because both are included in this commandment. It sits right in between as a both and statement. It's like this is the introduction or preamble to the following commands about how we are to relate to each other. And God makes it clear that it matters how we treat every person in society. The distinctions we would usually make are suspended. And this suggests that all of the following laws apply to the people outside of our normal circles, and that Sabbath is a weekly reminder of this. This is radical. I've also heard it said many times that this is the only command that includes the word remember, because we would forget Sabbath. We would try to squeeze it out. But what if God said remember because he knew that it was actually the idea of equality here that would be so hard for us? That this type of justice was so radical and so confrontational, it would quickly be swept aside. When you are the privileged one, you don't see. When you are not the oppressed one, you forget. And this is precisely what Sabbath is for. Remember the Sabbath day should echo to us, remember equality, remember others. But God was not done. He has more to reveal to us. Sabbath is bigger than just the 7th day in the week. It's a whole system of Sabbaths and Sabbathing. The Sabbaths were a collection of festivals and celebrations, markers of liberation for the planet and for people. In Leviticus 25, we see the Sabbath year, every 7 years, called a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land. It's one of the Sabbaths, designed to allow the land to regenerate, to optimize agricultural output, and essentially allow the land and people to flourish together. And then after that, also in Leviticus 25, we have the Jubilee years, the 7 times 7s. It's a Sabbath year too. It's the year when debts are cancelled, slaves are set free, land is returned. This was always God's plan, for Sabbath to be tied to rest for all and to turn the systems of the world upside down so that none would toil or labour without dignity, so that none would carry a burden of oppression, so that there would be no widening gap between the rich and the poor. And that no matter what happened in the preceding years, there was always a coming redemption, a Sabbath that would ensure everyone had an equal opportunity again and would remind those in power that in fact they were not. Whenever we see these patterns of 7 years, we know God is presenting us with the same idea. There is a cycle that's interrupted. Even when we get to the 70-week prophecies in Daniel, which our faith tradition has spent a lot of time talking about, ultimately what we see is a cycle interrupted. I'm less concerned about calculating dates than about seeing the great interruptions, holy interruptions. Each of the interruptions brings a realignment with God's purposes. I'm not suggesting we need to literally practice the Sabbath year and leave all land fallow over the whole planet, but ask the people who have doctorates on Sabbath economics and they'll be able to explain how it could be useful to us now. But I am confident that the Sabbath values are pertinent for us now, and that the big picture of Sabbath is more relevant than ever. Because the Sabbaths are opposite, reverse, and revolutionary. Rest for the land rather than exploitation so that we can live sustainably. Rest from financial burden to prevent a widening gap between the rich and poor. And rest from oppression and exile so that all can live in liberation. And rest from striving and sacrificing because Jesus paid it all. A holy interruption. Breaking cycles begins with breaking ignorance, breaking apathy, breaking silence. This is the work of anti-racism. Understanding that racism doesn't have to be hateful or intentionally mean to still be racism and still be harmful is the start of breaking those cycles. All of my own racism has been absolutely unconscious and absolutely unintentional, but still harmful to others, still toxic and damaging nonetheless. And it is precisely the unconscious and unintentional racism that's the most dangerous because it's so easily ignored and so quickly excused. 6 years ago, I was in the US, actually speaking in a few different places, ironically, on the topic of biblical justice and creation care. And I was also attending the Justice Conference in LA. I ended up in a conversation in a classroom with a friend and a whole group of people, and I was being asked about racism in Australia. They had just watched the film Rabbit Proof Fence, and I was able to describe our hidden histories, massacres, forced dispossession of land, stolen generation, the abhorrent White Australia policy. I talked about damaging stereotypes in the media. I even connected those histories to ongoing disparities in health and education today, the problem of the school-to-prison pipeline that we also have in Australia, and the rates of incarceration for Aboriginal population. I realise now that I held that knowledge that I did have quite pridefully because, like most people my age or older, I had not been taught any of that in school or by my church or by my parents. I had sorted out and learned those things as my own investment, and I felt somewhat enlightened and somewhat self-congratulatory. I could name disadvantage and generational trauma. But when I was then asked if I experienced white privilege in Australia, I fumbled an answer about certainly not experiencing any of those disadvantages, but not really having any particular privilege. I was flat out ignorant. I was wrong. I had not taken my learning any deeper into self-reflection to understand my complicity with the statistics I had just described. I didn't know what white privilege was. In my naivety, I thought that because I grew up wearing clothes handed down from other girls at my church, and I went to a public school, not a fancy private one, and my family's yearly holiday was to the Yamba Fishing Festival, I wasn't privileged. I assumed that white privilege was for the wealthy ones who went on overseas holidays and went to private schools and drove fancy cars when my family drove a used Volvo. But the reality is, I have lived every day of my life in white privilege. Now, no one in that conversation that day called me out on my white privilege or my ignorance, but I noticed a beat, a moment of silence, and I recognised that this was a term I didn't fully understand. So I knew I had to go and do some learning. I was an adult, it was the 21st century, there are no excuses for my ignorance. Black people had been writing literature on white privilege for decades, and I had not been listening. I then understood that denial of that privilege is deeply damaging and problematic. So from that moment, I began a slow journey of searching and learning about white privilege, systemic racism, and my learning continues still. I keep learning about microaggressions, tone policing, intersectionality. It's been a steep learning curve as I learn to identify and resist white fragility and resist indulging white guilt. And I'm regularly coming across new things to understand while I dig deeper and examine my whiteness. Holy interruptions aren't always easy, but they do change things. They change people. In our faith tradition, there has been much time and agitation devoted to who or what switched Sabbath to Sunday and the implications of that. But what about meaning? What happens when we ourselves change Sabbath from a day of holy interruption and revolution to a day we shouldn't go shopping? Or to a day we're concerned only with our individual rest? Or worse yet, a day concerned with proving our superior obedience or demonstrating our special identity with how we keep Sabbath? I'm pretty sure God is more interested in dismantling systems of oppression than whether or not we turn on Netflix on Sabbath. What type of Sabbath do you keep? I'm not saying that Sabbath isn't for prayer or isn't for worship or isn't for family of church. Of course, it's for all of those things and more. Sabbath as an idea is much bigger. As always, God's plan is bigger than we have allowed it to be. As always, God in his greatness wants to give us more and teach us more. In Mark 2, verse 27, Jesus said, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." The word for man here, anthropos, is a generic term, meaning mankind, the human race. The Greek word ano means an individual man, but anthropos includes both genders, male and female, and has a much broader application. The New Living Translation says, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath." The New Revised Standard Version says, "Sabbath was made for humankind." And the Passion Translation says, "The Sabbath was made for the sake of people." That doesn't sound to me like an opportunity for a nap. That sounds like a divine insurance policy, a grand system of protection, and not just for the people who observe Sabbath. Sabbath is not about us being peculiar or about us being right about creation. No, we must read the Bible in order to find God and understand others more than we read to find and justify ourselves. When we think of Sabbath as only rest for ourselves, we limit Sabbath, we minimize it. Of course we should rest, but we should also be reminded of those who don't rest and can't rest, or who carry burdens that we will never carry because of their race, gender, sexuality, ability, lack of education, or because of religious persecution. Sabbath is a weekly chance to realign our misguided priorities with the priorities of God. God is anti-racist, and Sabbath is a weekly reminder of this. Our Sabbaths don't exist in order to punctuate our time so we can just jump back into the same cycles week after week. Our Sabbaths restore us in order that we might become the ones who break those cycles. Just like the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year and the end of the 70 weeks, things should change after a Sabbath. While we rest, do we pause and pray for others who have no rest? While we replenish our energy for the work week ahead, do we also prepare ourselves for the work of anti-racism? While we invest in our local church, do we also think of ways to invest in our communities, particularly those most affected by systems that benefit us? What patterns need to be interrupted in your life, in your own thinking, in this world? What cycles am I caught up in that are harmful to me or others? What systems have I built or supported that need to be dismantled to make way for this better one, built on the cornerstone, Jesus Christ? We interrupt and disrupt things as they are and pause to imagine what they could be. In this way, Sabbath is a form of resistance. There is a lot at stake when we abandon the multifaceted beauty of Sabbath. I said in the beginning that Sabbath is like a glimpse of heaven, and it is indeed. It's a taste of all that can be. Rabbi Abram Joshua Heschel says Sabbath is a reminder of adjacency to eternity. He also asks, what would be a world without Sabbath? Indeed, what would be a world without equality, justice, peace, rest? Alternatively, what would be a world built on equality, justice, peace, and rest in the fullness and goodness of His grace? It would be luminous, a glimpse of heaven. Lord, may our Sabbaths ever propel us to usher in more of your kingdom now. Amen.